Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar with Professor Shibley Telhami. I'm Ori Nir with APN, and with me is Madeline Cheragino. She's APN's Director of Government Relations. Before I ask Madeline to introduce Dr. Telhami, two quick reminders. One is that this webinar is being recorded. We will post the audio as an episode on our podcast, Peacecast, later today. We'll also upload the video to our YouTube channel, and you will find links to both on our website. The other comment is that you are welcome and encouraged, actually, to ask questions during the Q&A session by using the Q&A button on your screen. Actually, you can start asking questions at any time, even now. Please do not use the raise hand button, but rather the Q&A button to ask your questions. Madeline, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be introducing Dr. Shibley Telhami, the Anwar Sadat Professor for Peace and Development and the Director of the University of Maryland Critical Issues Poll. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and he has advised in one form or another every administration from George H.W. Bush to Barack Obama. His best-selling book, The Stakes, America and the Middle East, was selected by Foreign Affairs as one of the top 5 books on the Middle East in 2003. His most recent book, The World Through Arab Eyes, Arab Public Opinion and the Reshaping of the Middle East, was published in 2013. And I am delighted to have Shibley join us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks. And Shibley's going to show a few slides that he's prepared for his presentation. And I'm going to ask Madeline now to launch the presentation so we can all see it on our screens. And in a moment, it will be shared for everyone. Great. Yeah. That's good enough size, right? I think that's fine.
Yeah.
Great. So Shibley, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the work you do on behalf of a just peace in the Middle East and your dedication, especially during very challenging times for everyone involved. What I'd like to do is really tell you about some of the shifts that are taking place in American public opinion on Israel-Palestine, by way of just presenting some of the most recent polling we've done after the Gaza war in terms of public attitudes and how they've shifted. And even the impact of the Gaza war itself, I think we can really say with a relative degree of confidence that the Gaza war has impacted, especially democratic public opinion on Israel-Palestine. I'll show that in some of those slides. But I think one of the starting points that we need to have is that, there's always been a gap between elected officials, whether they're in the White House or in Congress, and the public on Israel-Palestine, especially among Democrats. I've been documenting this for nearly a decade, where you see a wide gap where a Democratic public is increasingly critical of Israeli policies, want the US to be more even-handed, and obviously of elected officials taking a position to the right of their constituency on this. And the question is, that I've raised over the years, is this sustainable? Is this going to narrow over time? We've seen a little bit of that even in this environment, where during the Gaza war, when President Biden failed to criticize the bombings that resulted in huge civilian casualties in Gaza, or even the Israeli plan to expel Palestinians from homes in East Jerusalem, he got a lot of Democrats who were angry, including mainstream Democrats in Congress, who said, "You got to work to stop this." You've got so he discovered that even some of the congressional allies in a highly polarized environment were somewhat critical of him, and you'll see why and how that impacted public opinion. So let me start with some of our findings. This, by the way, was done in June and July of this year. So this is a recent poll, obviously after both not only after the Gaza war, but also after Netanyahu lost power in Israel and the emergence of a national unity government. And it really shows too that Democratic constituents aren't buying the change so much to influence their opinion on Israel-Palestine, because you could see that the war itself impacted their attitude toward Israel negatively, even despite Netanyahu's loss of power, which again means that there is something direct here that seems to be independent of the changing government in Israel. Let me show the next slides. So this is really about approval ratings of Biden, particularly in terms of ending the fight, his effort to end the fighting in Gaza. And you can see here, this is broken down by Democrats and Republicans, but if you look at the black line, that is the one that represents all Americans. And you could see that most Americans disapproved of Biden's handling. Now, even more strikingly, when you look at the blue line under the disapproval, the bottom two blue lines, and you add them together, you have 27.7 of the Democrats disapproving of the president's handling. Now, keep that in mind here. Keep in mind that when you look at Biden's overall approval ratings, even as they declined in the past couple of months, the disapproval among Democrats overall of his presidency has been less than 10%, really more like 5 and 6% throughout the entire period since he became president. And so the fact that you have 27.7% is really huge. And when you look at that among young Democrats, under 35, almost half of young Democrats disapproved of the president's handling of the ending of the Gaza war, the fighting. Next slide. So I want to show you in part why that is the case. Now, if you recall, the president himself pinned the blame principally on Hamas and didn't, as I said, refused to directly criticize Israel and Israeli action. But when you ask the public whom they blame for the crisis, sure, you've got the partisan divide, which is clearly Republicans overwhelmingly, blame the Palestinians. But when you look at the Democrats, it's interesting. You got 52% who say both equally. But when it comes to blaming Israelis and Palestinians directly, 35%, 34.8 to be specific, blame Israel, and 80.1% blame Palestinians. So the blame is far more on Israel among Democrats than it is on the Palestinians. And that is even more true among young Democrats, people who are under 35. Next slide, please. So the question of applying pressure on Israel, I think I have to say here, let me just note that I have been doing over the past decade a lot of polling on settlements specifically, whether Democrats wanted, for example, to apply sanctions or harsher measures on Israel over settlements. So for much of the past decade, a majority of Democrats, sometimes over 60%, wanted to apply even sanctions on Israel over the settlement issue. Didn't really ask this question specifically broadly. This is a question here, apply more pressure on Israel, including withholding aid. And again, if you look at the Democrats, which is obviously the constituency the president has to worry about the most, you can find that 43.7% say yes, and compared to only 8.5% who say must apply more pressure on the Palestinians. I want to also highlight that on this issue, my polling is not the only one. As you see, in fact, in recent months and years, a lot of people who tried to emulate some of our questions have found exactly the same results. We know the Gallup poll, which showed a majority of Democrats now want to pressure Israel more. And now we've seen the Pew poll again, that trend over time with more criticism of Israel over time. Now we have the Council on Foreign Relations, the Chicago Council public opinion poll, which was recently released. And I think I may have even the next slide. Could we see the next slide? It might be that right here. So this is the Chicago Council, which was taken July 7 to 26, again, after the Gaza war. And it says, do you support or oppose putting restrictions on US military aid to Israel so that it cannot use that aid toward military operations against the Palestinians? And you can see 62% of Democrats, actually 50% of all Americans favor that. So this is even a larger, it's obviously a different question than I had, that I postulated, but essentially the same trend, the same sentiment being reflected.
Maybe we should comment here, Shibley, that this issue for those of us who are sort of Washington veterans, in the past has been a taboo. It's been something that was not considered by either party as a viable option.
No, exactly. I mean, I think what happened, one of the things that happened over the past couple of years, you had mainstream congressmen, even like Chris Van Hollen, a senator, a prominent senator who I think is, center mainstream on Israel-Palestine, suggesting linking aid, not military aid necessarily, but sort of creating some kind of linkage. So yes, I mean, I think they're increasingly, they're feeling where the public is on this. I think a lot of Democrats in Congress are really beginning to sense that their constituents are far more open to this idea than they have been over the years. The next one. You can see here that more than half of respondents perceive their elected congressional representative to lean more toward Israel than they do. Now, I have to tell you, of course, this is a question that I have been asking for 30 years, actually a little over 30 years. That dates me a little bit. Sort of whether or not the American public wanted the government to lean more toward Israel, more toward the Palestinians, to be even-handed. Majority of American publics have always, all of these 30 years wanted the U.S. to be more even-handed. But among those who wanted the U.S. to take side, it used to be both Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly wanted the U.S. to take a side of Israel over the Palestinians. Now that has changed in recent years, particularly among Democrats. And we've seen that where overwhelmingly Democrats want the U.S. to be even-handed. But among those who want to take Israel's side, want to take one side or the other, they became far more even-handed. And in the last couple of years, and I'll show you here too, they've become actually slightly more leaning toward the Palestinians, and among young Democrats, even more so. So that's a big question that obviously wasn't reflected in the positions of elected officials in Congress or the White House for sure. And here, there was a direct question to all Americans, not just Democrats, whether the question was, compared with your view on this issue, how would you describe the positions of your elected congressional representatives on it? That the congressional representatives are more leaning toward Israel than you are, that they're more leaning toward the Palestinians than you are, or they're matching your position. And so interestingly here, take a look. I mean, 56.6% of the public think that elected representatives are leaning more toward Israel than they are. That includes Republicans. 44% say they're leaning more toward Israel than they are. I mean, that's really striking. But obviously among Democrats, 67.7% say their elected officials are leaning toward Israel more than they are. So it's not just that we see that there's a gap between the actual positions of members of Congress and the public, Democrats particularly, but it is perceived to be the case. They know that their elected officials are to the right on this question. So that's really interesting. The next slide. So here's the question that I described, which is leaning toward Israel. That's a stock question. It is one that I repeat even more than once a year. And I just generally try to track it. This is a tracking question. And as I told you, this has shifted over time. where we still have 62.7%. Look at that black line at the bottom, 62.7%. That is, the percentage of all Americans who want to lean toward neither side. We still have a majority who want to lean toward neither side, although Republicans now, slight majority, 50.7%, want to outright lean toward Israel. That didn't used to be the case 15 years ago, or even 10 years ago. But here's the interesting thing. So if you look at the first two categories, lean toward Israel, lean toward the Palestinians, and you look at the ratio, you find that almost twice as many Democrats want to lean toward the Palestinians that want to lean toward Israel, 17.9% versus 9.5%. So that's really kind of a fascinating shift that has taken place among all Democrats, which is even more so and clearer among young Democrats. Could you please show the next slide? So take a look here. And this is something that I want you to see is just change in 1 year, from August 2020 to July 2021. These are the two polls, the same questions, both very large sample. This sample this year, by the way, was over 3,000. And these are for Democrats under 35 years old, the young Democrats. So check and see in August, you still had more Democrats, young Democrats, say they wanted to lean toward the Palestinians more than Israel, 18.3 versus 11.4. But look at the change that occurred in 1 year, where now it's 34.5% versus 9.1% for Israel. That is a huge, almost, almost 4 times the number of people who want to lean toward Israel. Now that's a shift that must, given all of what I said earlier, is in all probability connected to the Gaza war. In all probability connected to the Gaza war. It's impossible to have that kind of shift in 1 year. This, by the way, is the largest shift we have ever seen on this issue in 1 year. And it is certainly the highest percentage of Democrats who want outright lean toward the Palestinians that we have ever captured. So clearly there was a direct impact, and I reinforce that again, I repeat, that this was taken also after the change of the Israeli government. And so even though Netanyahu, which was obviously disliked by many Democrats, was out of the picture, and there was a sense that, oh, there's maybe an alternative that will be closer to the Biden administration, you still have this, that people are not buying that change is going to alter the view of Israel on this one. Next slide. So I want to shift gears a little bit because I focus more on Democrats because I think that's where the big shift has occurred in terms of walking away from Israel, or Israeli policy. I don't want to say Israel because this is not a question about supporting Israel or not supporting Israel. And as I said, even still a huge majority of Democrats want to be even-handed. I mean, remember that. It's not that this is a criticism of the Israeli policy, obviously, not a anti-Israel mood among Democrats. But when you look at the attitudes among young evangelicals, and I want to put that in context, just take away the Democrats for now. We know that the change among Republicans has been more and more support for Israel. And that was even reinforced during the Trump years. And you could see now, even in what I showed earlier, is still very strong. There's no clear evidence of any major shift away from Israel among Republicans. But there is an interesting trend that we have witnessed in the past few years among young evangelicals. We know in the Republican Party, actually nationally, when I do a breakdown of the people who want to lean more toward Israel, evangelicals is the group that wants to lean toward Israel more than any other group, period. So we know that's really the core constituency of Republicans who want to lean toward Israel. So what is fascinating is that there are major trends that show that young evangelicals may be walking away from Israel. This was started in recent weeks when a North Carolina poll showed a major decline in the support for Israel among young evangelicals from 2018 to 2021. And as a result, I went and analyzed our own polling among evangelicals. I do major polls among evangelicals. I'm actually working on a book on evangelicals, politics, and Israel. I've been doing it for over 6 years, and I have several polls that I've done in between that is focused on evangelicals and attitudes on this issue. So this is not just taking evangelicals out of a poll. These are weighted evangelical distributions that we have done over time. And in doing the analysis, could you please show the next slide? I define, what we call young evangelicals, are people, again, under 35. The North Carolina poll define them as under 30. Small difference, but nonetheless notable. So if you look at this thing here, this is among evangelical Christians. This is just evangelicals and born again Christians, because there's the question. Some people identify themselves as both evangelical and born again. Some people don't, and we have that in here as the two categories. So you could see the shift from 2015 to 2018. These are young evangelical born again Christians. So take a look at how many people in 2015 wanted to lean toward the Palestinians. 3%. And take a look at how many people wanted to lean toward the Israelis, 40%. Look at, by the way, sorry, this is not the young evangelicals, this is all evangelicals. This is all evangelicals who are born again Christians from 2015 to 2018. So you can see that even among total evangelicals, a big drop where it almost evenly divided among those who want to lean toward Israel, lean toward the Palestinians in 2018. That's even before the North Carolina poll was taken. And the next slide, then I'll show the ones right here that are, this is the North Carolina poll. Forgive me. Let me go back. I'm sorry. I've made a mistake. This is the young evangelicals. I have versus the blue is the young evangelicals. The orange obviously is the over 35 evangelicals. So you can see just essentially observe the blue line, which is clearly the one where the differences are. So if you look at the blue lines, that's the young evangelicals. And you could see again, the huge shift from 2015 to 2018, even before the North Carolina poll. Let's go to the next one.
That's in the course of only 3 years, Shibley, right? I mean,
exactly, that's 3 years. And this one is from 2018 to 2021, and that was done by the North Carolina group.
And was the 2021 poll taken after the Gaza war?
No, before.
Before. Okay.
That was taken before, and also it's not an identical question. So you have to see. It's whether you support with Israel, sympathy with Israel, the Palestinians. So it's similar, but not identical. You can't compare apples and oranges here, but they're close enough to tell you about a trend. You can't take the numbers to be exact, but you can take the trend. So what they found, and also they define young evangelicals as 18 to 29. We go for 18 to 34. But you could see the trend among this group. Again, big change. From 20, the orange line is 2018, the blue line is 2021. And so you could see the drop in the support, sympathy with Israel drops from 69% to 33%. And sympathy with the Palestinians increases from 5 to 24%. Now, I could tell you what my speculation is on this, because I've written about sort of what we think is going on here. I would tell you that there are probably two major things, maybe three. One major thing is demographics. We do know that young evangelicals are changing demographically. For example, even between 2015 and 2018, there was a major shift in the percentage of whites among young evangelicals. In fact, young evangelicals became a minority among white evangelicals became a minority among young evangelicals. And we do know that white evangelicals tend to be the most supportive of a right-wing Israel. And so there is a demographic shift, and it's really traceable. It's a significant shift that we have shown to have taken place.
Just to make clear, a majority of young evangelicals today are non-white?
A slight majority. I believe it is the last one we've done. The whites are a little bit below half, so that's a fascinating shift that has taken place. That is taking place as we speak among evangelicals / born-again Christians. So the second reason, I think, is that we've known that young evangelicals tended to be more apprehensive about Trump and frustrated with the embrace of Trump by their leaders. There are many articles that were written about that, and that could be a possible reason, particularly for them walking away a little bit. And they associated Trump with being pro-Israel because of the closeness with Netanyahu particularly. And I think a third reason is likely that, like other young people in America, evangelicals now see Israel-Palestine more through the prism of social justice than through geostrategic or biblical prism. In fact, in North Carolina, poll also showed that they see Israel less through the biblical prism. And like other young people who are impacted by movements, not just like racial issues, but climate change, liberal issues, but the Black Lives Matter clearly influenced a lot of people, likely also influenced many young evangelicals. So there's a trend. We haven't really seen it yet impact the overall attitudes of Republicans on Israel. That's something to watch for, but it's fascinating that it's happening. Now, let me just end. I know we want to leave time for questions. So let me just end with the following. There's absolutely no question. I know people can poo-poo all sorts of polling on this, but look, if you look at everybody who's done it now, pretty much is showing a trend, particularly among Democrats. Evangelicals still need more study. I think that we haven't done enough among young evangelicals to know if this is something that's going to hold. But certainly among Democrats, we know, I mean, it's not, you don't even need to take polls to do it. You could see the discourse, you could see the language, you could see the coverage in terms of how there is a shift in support for Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. And I think that the question is whether it's consequential for politics. That's something that, of course, I would happy to answer in more details, but just for a quick reflection. Certainly, Israel-Palestine is not a top priority issue for most Americans, and that's what shields politicians from feeling the heat on this issue. We have so much more right now on our agenda. Whether it's the pandemic, racial issues, the economy, climate change, and now Afghanistan, and bigger issues, China, that obviously even people who are angry with politicians on this issue are not going to necessarily vote on the basis of it. And yet, I think we have seen already that it has impacted the electoral process. It has impacted in primaries where many politicians in Democratic primaries have shown that actually you can turn some criticism of Israeli policies into an advantage rather than a detriment in electoral politics. We've seen that multiple times in the last two election cycles. And I would even posit that this issue of Biden's position on Gaza could have hurt him in his overall ratings. We do know that over the past couple of months, the president's approval ratings have diminished. going down to 49%. And that decline is almost entirely coming from Democrats, That is a decline in Democratic approval. Now, obviously, there are many issues why that's the case. It's not Israel-Palestine, maybe a small part of it, but it certainly didn't help him. And there's no question that we have evidence that it certainly didn't help him, especially among young Democrats. I'll end with that.
Thanks. Fascinating. Since we, the last topic of the conversation was the issue of evangelicals, I wanted to ask a question about that. It's interesting. I remember that years ago when I was still working for the Jewish Forward here in Washington, I did a story about the changing trends among evangelicals, which did follow generational lines, where young evangelicals were more liberal on issues pertaining to the environment, abortion, and so on and so forth. Israel did not come into play yet at the time. Going back to the data that you showed, which I thought was really striking about the attitudes toward young evangelicals toward Israel and Palestine, could it be that there's a connection between the demographic issue that you pointed out and the third issue, the fact that people in general tend to view Israel-Palestine more toward a rights prism, that is something that is that characterizes the attitude of non-whites. In other words, a kind of a cross-sectional perception of the conflict, where they view it through the prism of rights in the United States, rights of minorities in the United States.
Yes, I think that there likely is a connection. Let me just say two things. One, just to be clear, you're right. Young people, even in the past, young evangelicals, like other young people, tend to be slightly different. Usually, it's slightly more to the left of their older, fellow older evangelicals and other Americans. But this, we have shown that the gap, the shift in attitudes among young evangelicals simply cannot be explained by generational. This is something bigger going on. That you don't have that kind of shift, and we've shown the trend across the nation in generation. This is much wider than you might expect. So clearly, it's not just generational. It is something else going on. But as you mentioned, yes, I think there's probably a connection between between the demographic shift of less whites among evangelicals and their attitudes on Israel-Palestine, seeing it more through the prism of social justice as opposed to through biblical prophecy. Yes, you're right. I think in general, when I do the demographic analysis nationally of all Americans, non-whites tend to be far more critical of Israeli occupation and policy and Israeli policy than whites. And so, that now is clearly being reflected in the views of evangelicals themselves, given the shifting demographic makeup of the group.
Thank you, Shibley. I was wondering if, looking at this polling, if you think that the Palestinian leadership could capitalize on this shift in U.S. public opinion, since it's creating a much more receptive environment for the Palestinian cause here. Are there ways for the Palestinians to better take advantage of this shift?
Well, I don't know about what the Palestinian leadership means or is, right? I mean, I would, if I were to look at liberal Democrats and progressive Democrats who are especially critical of Israel, I would find that they're probably even almost as critical of the Palestinian Authority, if that's what you mean by Palestinian leadership. And many question even their legitimacy. So I don't think that initiative by the Palestinian Authority as it stands, given its standing among the segment of the public that is more social justice based, I don't think its standing allows it to take the initiative for that. The question is whether the peace movement, people who want just peace in the Middle East, whoever they are, including Americans for Peace Now, others, can use that as a way of influencing in the political process. And I think, yes, obviously, I think there are lots of groups that have shown that it does. I mean, when you understand where the public is, then you have a lot of ways to impact the political process.
Let me posit a hypothesis and see what you think about it, since we're talking a lot about generational differences here and generational shifts in attitudes. The older generation, particularly in American politics, I think, tends to view Israel even not in the context of its conflict with the Palestinians through the prism of the Holocaust. Could it be that the lack of proximity which used to exist temporarily with the Holocaust is also a factor here?
I don't know. I am, obviously the Holocaust is not only a prism that has influenced a lot of opinion, but it clearly Americans of all, both right on the left and the right, have been exposed to that prism, right? So it's been something that is part and parcel of the American discourse about Israel-Palestine. I am doubtful that that's the prism that has defined the positions of Democrats and Republicans over time. We do forget how anti-Semitism was so prevalent in America, until, you look at we're talking about really until relatively recently, through the 60s and 70s, but before, how a lot of the groups that are now supportive of Israel have in the past taken positions, and some even now, who are really racist and anti-Semitic in their views. So I am not one who thinks that is really the driving force of American attitudes. It certainly is among liberals and progressive as some, and that's the interesting thing. Those are the groups that actually tend to be critical of Israel, but because their view is universal: anti-racism, social justice, democracy. They clearly see the Holocaust as something that is a hugely central experience that has to also shape their opinion. So oddly enough, I think probably the people who are influenced most genuinely by the Holocaust experience are the people who also tend to be more critical of the Israeli occupation, in my opinion. Now, it's not that people don't use it strategically, who are not. We have to differentiate between the rationalization of position and the experience as a driving force in the attitudes of people. And that's a debatable issue. I grant you that. I think it's too big to tackle in this conversation, but it's something that has to be considered, because when I look at the history of the relationship between the US and Israel, I don't see it the same way the narrative tells it about the Holocaust experience, even with Truman. I recently went back to read the letter that Truman's friend, who persuaded him to meet with Chaim Weizmann, ultimately to listen to the idea of recognizing Israel. He was, as you know, very reluctant to do so. And you look at the conversation, and it was really about political involvement. He had to be he had to be pushed to go along with that decision. So I think this, what is cause and what is effect has to be sorted out carefully.
Thank you. So I have a question from the audience about CUFI, that's Christians United for Israel. A lot of the pro-Israel evangelical traditional advocacy around this has been expressed mainly through CUFI, and they're, pretty traditionally around, as you would think evangelicals are around this. And people are wondering if you've done any polling where CUFI membership is distinguished.
Which membership? I'm sorry.
Christians United for Israel.
Okay. Yes, no, I have not done that, but I want to tell you something. I don't know, there's been a lot of debate about how much of their following is, and whether or not they exaggerate their followings. But I could tell you this: I have done a poll to try to figure out who is the most popular, who's the most popular religious leaders among evangelicals. And I can tell you that none of them, including Hagi, get large numbers. Usually they get less than 10% support, and sometimes they're not negligible support as a most admired leader. So it's more kind of constituencies that are focused on it. I think the one evangelical, the leaders who get the most are actually not even alive. And Martin Luther King gets more admiration than any of the names that are now being played out. So I think we need to be careful. This is a very effective, well-organized political religious group. And it does have intense support among certain constituency. It's not clear how pervasive it is, and the polling don't indicate that its leader is on the radar screen of most people who consider themselves to be evangelical.
Thanks. I want to relay two questions from the audience regarding the recent Gaza conflict. One of them has to do with the role of social media. In other words, can the dramatic spike or dramatic shift that we've seen in the data be attributed to the role of social media in this latest conflict? And the other question has to do, it's more of a data question here. Were any questions asked about which side was more responsible for the war?
Yes. So yes, I mean, let's go back to the second slide, please. Just can we go back and display slide 2?
Yeah.
Slide 3, actually. Slide 3, which is the second. Who to blame for the crisis? So we have this question: who to blame for the crisis? So you can see that it's very partisan. Obviously, 59% of Republicans, the red line, blame Israelis, and 31% blame both equally, and only 6% blame, for 5.9% to be exact, blame neither. So Democrats, though, take a look. I mean, 52% say they blame both equally, but among those who blame one side or the other, 34.8% blame Israel, and 8.1% blame the Palestinians. I mean, more than 4-to-1 ratio of blame toward Israel among Democrats. So, that tells you the story right there. I mean, I think I think that's what Biden was dealing with when people were not understanding why he's not at least criticizing both sides, where he's placing the blame specifically, no blame on Israel at all during that crisis. Now, the first part of the question, I'm sorry, could you repeat it? This was about blaming.
Social media.
Yeah, social media, yes, for sure. I mean, we're all trying to grapple with the impact of the social media. I actually study social media as well. I even have an academic article about the impact of Twitter with colleagues of mine that came out in a scientific journal recently on is social media polarizing beyond the sorting people into like-minded groups. And we found that, yes, it clearly has an impact. And we measured it very carefully over 2 polling experiments that we did. This was beyond Israel-Palestine. This was broadly about the impact of social media. So of course, we're all trying to figure out how much importance social media has. When you ask people, for example, about what is your main source of news, television among young people is not the principal source of news. They're going online, whether it's their groups of Facebook or Twitter, or Twitter is not even as popular among younger people. But it's Sure, they're going more online to get their news and friends. So there's no question that the social media has an impact. But I think there's been also the mainstream media had discovered that they're losing audiences if they don't cater to those groups. So you saw what happened with the New York Times in terms of putting the faces of the children on the front page, people who are victims of the war, and that's not something we had seen before in mainstream media. I mean, that was quite extraordinary, and there were attempts of catching up, so to speak, with social media on this one.
We have a data question here. Just wanted, which is also something that I was wondering about when I expressed amazement at the demographic data that you presented. So one of our attendees is quoting a figure from a Pew Research poll saying that only 8% of evangelicals are Black. So the question is, what is the makeup? Let's put it this way, among evangelicals, both younger and older, just so we get a picture.
Yes. First of all, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I want to say about Pew. Pew is not only an excellent and probably the best source of demographic distribution, but they were so kind as to do hard work for me to map out the actual distribution demographically across the country. And I used their demographic data for weighting my evangelical polls in terms of where the evangelicals are distributed, both in terms of age, race, as well as geographic. So, and I owe them a big debt because they really, I mean, they went out of their way to mine their data, because they have tens of thousands of people over a long period of time that they're able to do this. None of us have the capacity that they do. So I have a lot of respect for them. I don't know the exact distribution, but we have to make the following distinction. There's evangelicals and there's born-again Christians. I want to repeat that because that's not clear to a lot of people. I've discovered that in my early research on this issue, that they're not identical groups, that while almost all evangelicals consider themselves also born-again Christians, many of those who consider themselves to be born-again Christians don't consider themselves necessarily to be evangelical. They're divided in half, actually, of those, in the born-again Christian. The born-again Christian tends to have a larger proportion of non-whites in it than evangelicals. That is, born-again Christians who are not evangelical. And some of them also tend to be Democratic, not just Republican. And so we have to differentiate when people lump them together, as they do. Sometimes they say, are you evangelical Christian / born-again Christian? We actually break it down into two categories to try to tease out the overlap and the differences. When you ask that question, obviously, not only will you find some differences along party line, but you'll find demographic differences. The evangelical rights tend to be overwhelmingly white. The finding that among young evangelical, there's a trend away from that, that's interesting, that we find in two polls at least. Is this something that we can tell with a lot of confidence about the exact percentage? No, because what we can't tell is, even though we have a relatively large sample of evangelicals, it's still too small to map out major demographic change. So it tells you that there's a trend where more people are now non-white among young evangelicals. It doesn't tell you the exact numbers. It tells you that that's increasing, and that appears to be a factor in what is happening among young evangelicals specifically. And again, the fact that we now have, I had initially, back in 2018, I mentioned this, not with a lot of confidence, because I was waiting to see whether a lot of polls would show the same shift among young evangelicals. The North Carolina poll obviously reinforced that. That's why I went out and put that article out to show that there is increasing evidence in that direction. we need to do more. As I said in my Brookings article, we really don't fully understand that. Those hypotheses I put on the table were what I call them preliminary speculations, informed speculations, but they're not, we don't have enough to map out a different demographics of the constituency.
Thank you. I was wondering, how the Israeli public is responding or processing, and you can loop in the Israeli government as well to this shifting attitude. I know that there has been a strategy in approaching evangelicals, but do you see that changing now?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, the whole thing about evangelicals was principally a function of Likud, because the strategy of reaching out to evangelicals, you have to understand that dates back to the days of Menachem Begin. It was really the Israeli right that helped cultivate that relationship, dating back with reaching out for Jerry Falwell Sr. Back in the 1970s during Jimmy Carter days, and also kind of latching on to the moral majority, and then reaching out to Jerry Falwell specifically with requests that are documented, that we've found in the archives about, like opposing arms deal to Saudi Arabia or things of that sort. The Israeli right has seen a great benefit in cultivating that relationship. Obviously, it was mutually beneficial for the evangelical right as well. This was a relationship that was emerging, and they were rising. And Netanyahu, more than any other prime minister, I think, sought to cultivate that. And Netanyahu became a real hero for American evangelicals. In 2015, when I did a poll, just at the beginning of the presidential election campaign, and I asked an open question: whom among world leaders do you admire most? Open question. Netanyahu was slightly ahead of Ronald Reagan among evangelicals as the most admired leader in the world. So there was a relationship that is cultivated. Netanyahu made it more a strategy. We do know that his ambassador to the US, Ron Dermer, certainly focused on it. He was even accused of hosting more evangelicals than other groups in the Israeli embassy. And he himself said, maybe we should start shifting away from looking at American Jews as the main constituency and paying more attention to evangelicals. That's when a lot of people came against him. So I don't think that is that he reflected a prevalent view in Israel. And I think that Israelis clearly see that the benefit and support from the evangelicals in the political environment, but I doubt that it is more than that. I doubt that it's obviously it's not a value driven alliance. It is an alliance of convenience, and most Israelis see it that way.
I think we have time for one more question that I'll try to wedge in, although it's maybe a big one, which reflects several of the questions that we've had from the audience. And that has to do, we talked about the increase in sympathies toward Palestinians. Let's talk a little bit about the reasons for the decline in sympathies toward Israel, particularly among young people. And the question is, and I realize that it's probably difficult to deduce it from polling data, but does that have to do more with policies, issues like settlements and the nature of the occupation and so on, or is it something that has to do more with the image of Israel, particularly in the past few years, the alliance between Netanyahu and Trump, and the overall shifting right of Israeli society and the Israeli polity?
Okay, so let me give you my own take on this, and I think it's the short answer is it's both of these things, but let me just say that when you look at the period even prior to the Obama years, when we saw the major tension between the U.S. and Netanyahu, and ultimately the Trump years that were highly polarizing, and Israel was seen to be a Trumpist country, so to speak, among Democrats. There was already a trend, and we have been tracing it because you could see it. I've written about it multiple times, that reflected both demographic change within the Democratic Party, the rise of more African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, women, young people, all these groups that have been more focused on social justice and see Israel more as an occupier, increasing. Not anti-Israel, there's no indication of that. And as I said, still overwhelming majority of Democrats want to be, quote, even-handed. They're not want to be anti-Israel. It is that they're shifting away from what used to be strong support for Israel. And it is driven by those issues, because when we ask questions specifically about issues, then you see the numbers rising over time. Now, of course, it's true that what happened under Obama, when obviously there was a conflict not only over the Palestinian question and settlements initially, but especially about Iran, and Netanyahu coming to the U.S. Congress to give a speech behind the back of the president, criticizing Democrats, seeing him more as pro-Republican than pro-U.S. And clearly during the Trump years, as I said, polarizing years, seeing Israel really in some ways is a domestic American issue. It's not just a foreign policy issue. And Netanyahu, the fact that Republicans think of him as one of their heroes when you ask him an open question tells you the story. He's seen as one of them. And obviously Democrats see him a little, not quite the opposite, but certainly more the opposite than not. And so I think both of these are true. But I think it doesn't matter how this evolved, that's what it is now. And there's no evidence that a new tone of an Israeli government that doesn't change the profound policies that have been anchored in the democratic minds in an era where social justice is the issue of the day for Democrats. The new Israeli government is going to shift that or change that as long as there's no shift in policy. And I can tell you something else, which is that my colleague Mark Lynch at the GW and I have last February done a poll among scholars of the Middle East who are members of the American Political Science Association or members of the Middle East Studies Association. And we had quite a large group, over 500 people who responded, 520 people who responded. And when you ask them, how would you describe Israel-Palestine now? We had like 55% say Israel-Palestine is now a one-state reality akin to apartheid. That is telling you that it's not just about policy, right? It is about the entrenchment of the occupation after a half a century with no end in sight, that people find just absolutely unacceptable, people who are focused on social justice issue. And I take that group because I think, sure, it's not going to represent American public opinion or even the scholarly world, period, but these are people who follow the issue closely. And they do tend to be quite ahead of a shift. And so I think there's something deeper that is going on. The question is whether it's going to impact policy or not. It's not whether it's happening. It is happening.
Dr. Telhami, Shibley, thank you very much. The two articles that we referred to here, the one about attitudes following the Gaza war and the one about evangelicals, can be found on the Brookings website if people just search under Dr. Telhami's name. And I want to thank Madeline for co-hosting this webinar. Shibley, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Thank you
to all the people who joined, and to those celebrating, I want to wish Shana Tova, Happy New Jewish Year, and Happy Holidays.
Shana Tova.
Thank you. Thank you.